then you can sort of introduce yourselves and speak for about 15 minutes. And then we can ask each other questions and we'll move on to the second and third presentation. So the first person we've got here is Lace Jackson, and Lace is going to talk to us about a global majority gaze, whiteness and leadership. And she's at the Open University, but also she works at Bedford University too. So,
Thank you, Aljit.
okay.
You okay for me to share my screen?
So,
Hold on, I just need to. Everybody see that?
we can't, yeah, we can see you all slides, just needs to go on to slideshow.
Oh, I can't see that. Hold on.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to do that first.
We can see your slides, but they're the whole screen, the whole set of slides. So it just needs to.
Yeah, I can't seem to change that because I've just stopped sharing and can you see that now? Is that the whole screen? Is that better?
Yes,
Right.
perfect. Thank you.
Okay, good. Hopefully it all um can you see if I move it on?
Um, just this first title slide that we can see.
Has that moved on for
Yeah,
you now?
yes, it has. Thank you.
Right, okay, I'll go back to the first one. Thank you. Okay, hi, I'm Dr. Lace Jackson, and I'm going to hopefully try and present what has been a 7-year journey of discovery for me in terms of a global majority gaze and whiteness in leadership. So I always grapple with whether I should not share my autoethnography at the beginning, as I feel sometimes like a bit of a Phyllis Wheatley in terms of giving legitimacy to why I'm here. So just in terms of a bit about me, I'm a first generation child born in the UK to immigrants, formerly recognised as the Windrush generation. I was educated in the English school system and worked in Eurocentric organisations since 1987 to present. And the majority of my working life has been spent in public services, both as a frontline social worker, in touch with a number of social issues, except for my disastrous decision to leave school and work in insurance for about 18 months, but that's another story. I spent time during my working life working with drug using mothers in the East End of London. I've been a practice manager in a multi-agency safeguarding hub and various professional and director roles in a local authority in terms of learning development, independent management review writer for serious case reviews, and latterly, prior to joining the HI Institute as an executive director of a clinical institute. So I've had quite an extensive leadership practice before I embarked on my PhD. And but I also experienced an identity threat. But before I go into that even more, I want to give a health warning to some of this presentation. So I do come from a critical stance in my approach to research and a social constructionist ontology. And so I do feel that some of this presentation might be uncomfortable for all. It might be triggering for some and maybe a bit downright depressing for others. However, it's not to evoke feelings of white guilt, white fragility, or even white fear, but it's an invitation for us to examine together this discourse and to take accelerated action for a better understanding of whiteness as an invisible force that has consequences for leaders and leadership, given we're talking about leadership. So, from a global majority gaze, whiteness is understood here as a place of radical privilege and an embodied legitimized position linked to taken for granted social practices that results in structural and systemic marginalization of those not seen to be white. Global majority are those identified from an African, Caribbean, infra-Saharan cultural ethnic backgrounds, more laterally known as the Global South. But their extraction is a large one. So, three-quarters of global citizens are from these backgrounds who are often exposed to microaggressive practices, such as being told that we often play the race card. However, when we look at from a black gaze, then whiteness has instituted since empire, colonialism, and slavery. Whiteness has been used to differentiate those considered white at the time as different from slaves, such as indentured servants and apprentices. So, whiteness, in other words, has been playing the race card for a number of years and potentially since its inception. The only issue is that as we go through this presentation, we'll see that it's more the ace up the sleeve or the trump card, excuse the pun, rather than being seen as the blackjack. So, in terms of my data set, when I looked at this, I was exploring what was the experience, so lived experience of global majority leaders experiencing and practicing leadership in the UK. I looked at this across a number of sectors, so including higher education institute, judiciary, policing, sporting, social care, social work, etc. And I had 35 global majority leaders, 22 of them female, 13 males from global majority backgrounds. And it's interpretive epistemology that I used. I'm using narrative analysis, using genre analysis and autoethnography because I felt that we are never not part of our research and using reflexive practice to maintain that kind of objectivity, even though I was part of the research myself. So, in terms of overall, the research contributes to a small body of knowledge by offering valuable insights into the leadership practices of global majority individuals. I'm clearly not going to go through all of this in 15 minutes, but I did want to show the kind of grand themes that came out of the findings, so distilled into two overarching grand themes of experience and practice, and then five sub-themes of the societal milieu, the organisational milieu, and then personal and professional challenges, and then the response by global majority leaders in terms of their experience and practice. So, showing some emancipatory leadership practices that resist the normative leadership and dominant identity that is usually enacted within Eurocentric organisations. So one of the things that I did want to present is to look at it from a different gaze. So usually I think research talking about racialized identities, etc., focuses on a victimhood or the victim narrative. And what I wanted to look at was the systems and we've talked about here complexity leadership, we've talked about systemic leadership within organizations. So I wanted to look at, well, what's the system in play within Eurocentric organizations, particularly because I was looking at it from a UK context. So I want to look at what is whiteness and how does it operate within leadership and practice, but also to invite us to think about how we might as leaders develop courageous and emancipatory leadership practices. So I want to introduce, in a sense, the pyramid of structural shadism if you assign to the kind of belief that there is no such thing as race, although there is racism. And so in that sense, if it's a biological fiction incorporated within race, then actually we talk about shadism and how that can be perpetuated regardless of the ethnicity that you are. So we have a triangle or a pyramid of what is a normative structure within organizations. So we start at the base of the triangle where we have the biased culture that contains things like the invisible force fields of cultural bias. So at this level, it includes the subtle things that people ignore, the invisible force fields, where whiteness is normalized and where other cultures are devalued. Because of the assumption that the leadership prototype or the legitimacy is about whiteness, i.e., the beauty standards based on low level stereotyping and sometimes conscious and unconscious bias. This layer trains our perceptions and what is considered acceptable or not acceptable, what is professional, who is urban, or as Judith Butler asserts, what is human and less human. The lateral faces reproduce that marginalisation. So it's where active bias takes place. I call it in my research the operationalised marginalisation of others. So connecting this apex to the base is where active bias takes place in both narratives and behaviours. My research talked about the transference of societal norms into organisational norms, where individuals and groups are operationally marginalised through policy frameworks and practice. For example, recruitment and hiring bias, so biased psychometric testing, racial classification forms, pay gaps, health disparities, sentencing and policing in terms of stop and search. And we've talked a lot about AI today. So things like AI algorithms, facial recognition, and how that again kind of continues the status quo of marginalisation of certain groups of people. It's where housing, education segregation, environmental inequalities, financial bias, i.e., bank loans, insurance costs, higher loan interests takes place. And then we then move to the top of the triangle or the pyramid, where we call it the apex of white psychosis, where there is enacted racial harms, and how that then lends itself to what happens in terms of the tone of leadership within organisations. So white psychosis, i.e. introduced by Fanon, refers to the concept of whiteness as a collective delusion or systematic pathology that distorts reality to maintain racial privilege and deny the existence of racism. It's a metaphorical framework used in critical race theory and whiteness studies, so various writers like Andrews, D'Angelo, myself, Jackson, to describe how societal structures, cultural narratives, and individual beliefs can sustain racial hierarchies, where it suggests that white individuals and institutions often engage in collective delusions and hallucinations to avoid confronting systemic racism, historical injustices, and ongoing inequalities. However, the psychosis of whiteness, and that's where I talk about shadism instead of racism, is not reserved just for white people. And when we talk about whiteness, we talk about it in a political sense as opposed to the colour of people. It is a distortion that's rooted in Western society and can be produced by those of any hue when we talk about internalized racism. This is the power of psychosis. At this level, it is the systems of white psychosis that everyone can recognize, where we see that racial violence, hate crimes, racial slurs, extremism. It's a tip of the iceberg that ignores the base of how we normalize biased cultures, which leaves structural racism intact. So whiteness, the invisible organizational force field, is what I found in terms of my research. It creates unequal starting points. We had GM leaders describing leadership progression as an uneven race. It's the 100-meter dash versus the 100-meter hurdles, where whiteness provides an unearned head start for white leaders due to structural legitimacy for white leaders. It reproduces organizational cultures where The organisational milieus include environments marked by white solipsism, which is for the benefit of white people. So it's about how these dynamics can create cold, exclusionary, and intense scrutiny, where we have token roles, lack of networks, and constant judgment of global majority leaders and their competence. And it's where also there's a normalized exclusion where there is an invisible whiteness that overlooks or ignores the work, even when equally or more qualified people or global majority people are there in terms of their peers. Peggy McIntosh framed this as the invisible knapsack of privilege that allows white leaders to exclude others, to control opportunities, and to set those cultural norms. It's where material and social consequences follow, where these experiences lead to professional challenges such as stereotype bias, exclusion, being measured by different yardsticks, hypervisibility, and yet invisible. But however, some of the themes, these are some of the actual direct quotes from those GM leaders that talk about, how whiteness in terms of professional challenges benefits um, individual leaders in the sense of those that are most powerful think they can do what they want to people and they can walk on people. And the higher up you go, the more leadership power you have, but they choose who will be in these levels and it's not open to everyone. So the research highlights how dominant leadership works to benefit whiteness through solipsism, unearned advantage, head starts, misappropriation, and oppression for progression. We also see the invisibility of whiteness in that you're measured by a different yardstick to white people. We talk about how they're overlooked, they're invisible, and where even if you are in a place of leadership as a global majority leader, you're dismissed, you're ignored, and that can be a regular occurrence. And that's how whiteness is often seen through a Black gaze. So, how do global majority leaders, if we um, deal with this or negotiate this kind of environment? My top tips. So, if you can see this icon here in terms of the model, they use a number of leadership practices that do align with the leadership practices or characteristics that were coming out of the advanced HE survey that we saw, where we talk about collaborative leadership, we talk about relational leadership. However, there is a unique leadership practice that's modelled by global majority leaders that were found in the UK. So things like responsible, relational, resilient, gendered. But gendered means using humour and satire as a genre to get through some of the marginalisation, particularly for women leaders. We talk about faith-based leadership as being an underlying and underpinning leadership practice, but most importantly, benevolent leadership, kindness in leadership. So what we can do in terms of looking at this for leadership in our HEI Institute is how do we make the invisible visible? We all have a responsibility to call it out. Whiteness often operates unnoticed by those who benefit from it. So if we recognise those ideas are heard, who's validated, who is invited into decision-making spaces and who is overlooked, we engage in the first step to disrupt inequity and address selective inclusion. We need to interrupt biased leadership pipelines. We just heard a previous talk on the awarding gap and looking at how we can deal with that in terms of our student recruitment. This should be how we look for our pipeline of leadership. We interrogate recruitment and succession processes that legitimize white leadership as the default. Don't accept the taken for granted tone, especially when less experienced or underqualified white colleagues are chosen over more experienced and overqualified GM leaders. We need to cultivate culture, not cultures, by actively building inclusive norms and challenging micro exclusionary practices and cold and hypercritical milieux. How do we eliminate this through the informal cultural gatekeeping? We've talked about that again in other presentations that I've heard today. And how can we expand legitimacy and set the leadership tone? How do we standardize expectations and reduce scrutiny of marginalized individuals and groups? We can do this by distributing power and inviting genuine diversity of voice into decision-making spaces. And we need to be able to recognize diverse forms of leadership excellence, not just those that we consider to be normative or dominant within our institutions. Most importantly, we have to move from passive awareness to active allyship. Challenge witness, challenge whiteness, by sponsoring GM leaders and aspirant leaders. Open up our professional and social networks. Amplify their contributions rather than engaging in misappropriation. Practice reflexivity, cultural humility, and accountability. All of this is easily said, but sometimes hard to do. But the hard work and core work of active allyship is to examine how we, you, I, personally benefit from existing structures and how we may consciously and unconsciously perpetuate exclusion and marginalisation, particularly when keeping silent in the face of epistemic and social injustice. And that's me in terms of any questions.
Thank you so much for sharing that research and those insights and some tips there. I forgot to say should have given you a time warning, but I didn't. So I propose that we move on to the next two speakers, and then if we've got some questions, we can ask each other. And I think we had one other person who joined us. That was Lucy. So maybe she can ask some questions as well. So if I can invite John Speakman and Kalina Navona, I think I've pronounced it okay, about building engagement, applied leadership and student teams. There might be some crossover themes coming through. So
that's probably.
do you want me to give so for 15 minutes when you've done your 15 to 18 minutes talk? I'll put my hand up. I'll put my hand up. Yeah. But you might not. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Can you make sure it is your screen? Hello?
We can see that whole slide set. You just need to press slideshow.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Screen sharing it's
no screen sharing. Okay, I'm sorry.
It's all right, we all have this technical.
Share and do
window
or entire screen would be easier.
And this thing.
The entire screen.
The entire screen. Okay.
And then share. And then switch over to that one.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Okay, I guess we get started. So I'm John Speakman. I'm a Doctor of Artificial Intelligence down at Falmouth University, lecturer in games, artificial intelligence computing, and foundation researcher on student engagement.
And hello, my name is Kalina Nenvo. I'm a researcher at Falmouth University working on extensive literature review and conducting series of student interviews and surveys on the subject of student engagement. Together, we have organized a team of researchers trying to create momentum and bring awareness about building engagement through applied leadership in student teams and academic environments by reframing engagement as a leadership responsibility. As you have most likely experienced and seen yourself, there are students that attend regularly, contribute consistently, submit work on time and follow instructions, but are not quite invested in the outcome. So currently what we recognize is engagement is attendance, participation, and submission. These are traits which are visible to staff, easy to measure, convenient for institutional application, and established as standards. However, the perception of these traits may miss signs of disengagement and team misalignment. We're confident in measuring engagement, but we can't detect it and how it looks like. So this leads to a decline in student retention and drop in student outcomes, and the increase of the need of human resources to support students. This is not a failure of students, but the failure of the education system. If behavior cannot distinguish engagement from disengagement, and we define it through what we can observe rather than what it is, then we're not measuring engagement but compliance by using proxies, which fragments our understanding of engagement, creating systemic failure. For example, a student that attends every timetabled session, contributes and submits work on time, but is not very engaged or anxious. It is very anxious during class and is not very attentive. In a team, this can appear as a collaboration, but to many it can look like as compliance mistaken for engagement. Another student misses sessions, doesn't attend regularly, but is deeply invested in their work and their studies. In a team, this can look like someone that holds a great passion for specific parts of the project, but doesn't show up regularly or doesn't speak up about it. So this is where we're looking at standard frameworks such as Agile as an approach to working and building a team environment in uncertainty, change, and with collaboration. Instead of relying on fixed plans and rigid processes, Agile emphasizes adaptability, continued learning, and creating quality through small iterative steps. This prioritizes individuals and interactions over strict procedures, working outcomes over comprehensive documentation, collaboration over negotiation, and responsiveness over following a plan. In practice, Agile creates environments where teams can adjust as they learn, stay focused on what matters, and maintain alignment over over time, and that they spend in control and prediction of the outcomes. In education context, Agile provides a flexible structure that helps teams stay aligned, make decisions together, and remain engaged as projects evolve, rather than becoming stuck or disengaged when plans inevitably shift. Scrum is a simple framework from Agile that helps teams organize their work through short focus cycles called sprints. Instead of trying to plan everything up front, teams work in small increments, regularly review processes, and adapt as they go. It introduces clear roles, shared goals, and frequent check-ins, which support communication, accountability, and reflection. In an educational context, Scrum provides structure without rigid control. It helps teams stay aligned, respond to change, and maintain an engagement over time. We have developed a new definition of psychological state of engagement that moves beyond observable behavior and treats it as a psychological state. By defining engagement as coherent, feedback and stimulus sustained psychological state rather than a set of proxies, this framework shifts our understanding away from what is visible to what is actually happening internally, asking the question, why is someone investing their effort and finding meaning in what they do? By framing engagement as alignment rather than activity, we can more accurately understand when it is present, when it breaks down, and how it can be intentionally supported. Our definition is based on E-theory, which is a standard model in business practices, and reframes leadership as a practice of creating conditions where people willingly invest themselves in their work. Instead of relying on control, hierarchy, and compliance, it focuses on voice, shared purpose, and meaningful participation. When people understand what they're contributing to, feel able to influence it, and see the impact of their effort, their attention, motivation, and sense of significance align. Oh, sorry. In this way, E-theory provides practical foundation for designing environments where genuine engagement can emerge and be sustained. In practice, this means shifting from directing behavior to shaping the environments by clarifying purpose, enabling contribution, and maintaining open communication. Leaders focus on how decisions are made, how voices are heard, and how processes are shared. When these conditions are presented, teams regulate themselves more effectively, take ownership of their work, and remain engaged without constant oversight. Engagement becomes not something enforced, but something that arises naturally from how the system is designed. We use these models together to maintain alignment through structural routines and relational conditions. Agile provides a manifesto which guides the direction of the ethics. Scrum provides a formal framework with clear, replicable methods to support communication, scope, and autonomous management. E-theory provides a tried framework for analysis of social cohesion breakdown and detecting it and prescribing misalignment and when it happens.
So essentially what we're saying here is performance emerges from engagement. Performance does not produce engagement. Engagement produces performance. In this, engagement is not something that people bring, it is something that leaders create the conditions for. So really what we're looking to do here is to move from managing behavior to managing conditions. Behavioral traits we need to recognize as reactions to a working environment, managing what blockers and drivers are causing behavioral procedures or lead to more autonomy. This means shifting from correcting behavior to shaping working conditions or structuring delivery to meet needs. It moves behavior and outcomes from being a student responsibility to a leadership responsibility, one which can become autonomous beyond delivery and facilitation. So I'd like to talk a little bit about our work down at the Games Academy at Falmouth University. To build in this working experience, teamwork in practice, a core element of teaching at the Games Academy is this model for team projects. At every point in the academic cycle, at least one module is dedicated to teamwork. In practice, students collaborate to produce a complete, interactive, immersive experience, combining a range of skill sets and a domain that covers many different domains to make a game over a full academic year. This brings together a range of students from diverse courses: programmers, artists, animators, musicians, and game designers, really all collaborating in one space. So I'd like to talk about an example of kind of how this goes through. Starting with these year-long team projects with no clear alignment of purpose or vision, without method or interjection, disengagement will become the default state. It compounds if a single vision or an artifact led by one person overrules. It constructs a dynamic of manager and employee. There's no ownership of the product and no personal agency. Students begin to become disengaged, and they will gradually become more disengaged. They do not want to work on a project. They'll work only when they believe they have to, like clocking into a job. And only beyond that point do we begin to measure a drop in attendance. So by building formal models to encourage identifying common drivers for a vision, empowering communication early, and working with teams to help them identify shared interests, we can build a flatter starting point and a direction people want to take ownership over together. So thinking about interventions, really what we want to do is shift people towards advocacy, to become advocates for engagement, to really understand what engagement looks like and be able to reflect and diagnose their own team's engagement and build a culture that can lead itself. Really, this means Agile, Scrum, E-theory, self-reflection are not productivity tools. They build autonomy and shared passion and shared direction. They are mechanisms for building and restoring alignment between each other. As an advocate, we want to see people who can inspire each other, communicate and express their feelings, to be able to promote collaboration and exploration, to encourage transparency, to uphold engagement values during development, to negotiate rather than compromise. And as a culture, we expect people to start to drive discussion between each other, to be excited for learning from the mistakes and to not fear making them, to explore and be curious, to be open to receiving help, to be passionate about progress and share that passion, to make friends and enjoy the process. But behind this really is that need for the ability to be open about people's emotions with each other. So certainly down at the Games Academy, we're looking at really bringing that change leads to passion. When students see games forming the identity that they personally feel part of, building a project that they personally care for, with a clear common goal and a shared direction, a student project becomes a passion project. It shifts from an assessment to a celebration of work. From I don't dislike our game, I just rather spend my time doing something else, to I can't pull myself away from working on it. So I want to talk about a few examples of some games I've helped the journey process with. The first one here is Cycle. This is a game which was able to really demonstrate a lot of artistic freedom, to be able to work together, to be able to collaborate effectively and really communicate the shared principles they want to attain. The next one here is Petal. This was an undergraduate project. The team went on to do a master's degree together and they built the foundations of a large scope game. And this year they founded a business and they're now funding a commercial project as a team, the same students that we walked through the original journey. And Kill to Death, this is a team, it's one of my current teams. They are currently looking to incorporate together. There's someone who started the academic cycle unfamiliar with each other, with no clear vision, from a range of different backgrounds, and gradually, as they learned these formal methods, they began to build strategies to communicate, and eventually were able to align their interests to figure out what they wanted to make, what they wanted to express, and what identity their project, their work should be, and therefore take personal ownership and fall in love with what they were making. And hopefully this comes across in the work that they're building.
John, can I just interrupt? Sorry to interrupt. Would you be able to wrap up in the next sort of minute because we're sort of running over now?
Yeah, we're on the last couple of slides. So effective learning environments are essentially those that carefully manage how patterns become visible to the learner, rather than just representing information. Strong teaching sequences and experiences learners can discover as structure at the edge of their current ability. So we can use scaffolding, guided discovery, iterative feedback to sustain this continuous movement from uncertainty to understanding. So really our point here is to lead this deep understanding of how we can build the interests of people and move them forward through education, through really working with what helps them to learn from the ground up. If we measure behavior, we design for compliance. And if we understand engagement, then we start to design for alignment. Ultimately, if we provide the right environment, people will engage themselves when they are invited and contribute to their everyday operational decisions, their impact strategy, and the change that affects them and what they can themselves affect. So thank you very much. That ends our presentation.
Any questions? Do we have time?
I'm so sorry to interrupt you on there. So thank you, yes, for your presentation. At the moment, we only have our presenters. So I just want to give the opportunity to Zita to have her 20 minutes, 15 minutes to talk, and then we can have a little bit of a roundtable conversation. It must be very daunting to do a presentation and nobody's sort of asking you questions, but we all sort of ask each other. So Zita, if I can bring you in to speak for 15 minutes and then we'll wrap up, and then you've got a break before the next session after this. Thank you, John and Kalina. So, Desita, I'll put my hand up and then it's when you've done your 15 minutes input.
No problem. Can you
Lovely.
see the slides okay?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Lovely, brilliant. Okay. So you want me to start now?
Sorry, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to Event HE for the opportunity to speak today. Unfortunately, I'm just getting through a cold, so my absolute apologies if I sneeze or cough through this. I do apologise, but I want to briefly position myself, not to centre myself, but to be transparent about the lens which through I lead. So my name is Dazita Taylor. I'm a mixed race woman of white Irish and Black Caribbean heritage. I'm an operating department practitioner by background, an associate professor and a former head of department in a large UK university. I've led teams through COVID-19, Ofsted scrutiny, apprenticeship reforms, and major workforce pressures, often as the only woman of colour in the room. But this is not an autobiography. My lived experience matters only because it shapes how I lead, how I make decisions under pressure, navigate uncertainty, and sustain inclusive cultures when systems are under strain. And my dissertation work, Still I Rise, made one thing really clear. Identity and leadership are not separate, they intersect, especially from those of us that lead from the margins. The focus of this talk is how authentic leadership is shaped by lived experience, becomes a strategic asset in UK higher education, especially when navigating the inequality pressures and change. So today is about leadership from the margins, not as a deficit, but as a strength. So if we pause on the data for a moment, we've probably seen this data quite a lot during today. The message is always really stark. When we disaggregate representation in UK higher education, Black and mixed Black women don't just lag behind, we almost disappear, particularly at senior and strategic levels where power and culture are shaped. And that disappearance matters. When a group is not visible in the data, they are rarely visible in decision making, succession planning, or leadership pathways. And throughout my research, something else became really clear. Mixed race women are often statistically erased. We feel grouped, averaged out, or rendered invisible. And when that happens, institutions cannot see patterns of progression or where barriers actually sit. So for me, this is not about a lack of ambition or talent. The pipeline exists, entry is not the problem. What we see instead, I feel, is a quiet disengagement at key points: progression, sponsorship, stretch opportunities, recognition, often shaped by earlier life experiences. So this is not simply a diversity issue, it's a leadership and systems issue. So this talk draws on autoethnography, not as a personal narrative, but as a way of treating lived experience as leadership data. So in other words, experience is not storytelling here. It's evidence analysed critically within institutional and sector contexts. Intersectionality is a sense-making tool. It allows me and others to examine how race, gender, class, professional identity all interact to shape leadership opportunity, credibility, and constraint in higher education, particularly within senior leadership spaces. And crucially, this is not reflection for reflection's sake. The emphasis is on reflection that leads to leadership action. So, how insight informs decision making, culture shaping, and practice within real institutions under real pressure. So this lens is less about us telling a story and more about understanding systems through the standpoint of those navigating them and translating that understanding into leadership capability. So I've chosen 3 leadership moments out of many I could have chosen. I begin with this one because it shows how intersectional bias starts long before formal leadership roles. So as a mixed race child, I learned early that institutions often manage identity rather than honour it. So in predominantly white schools, my name was shortened to D because it was considered too difficult to pronounce. Racism was rarely named, comments about my hair were normalised and ignored, concerns were ignored, and support was near enough absent. So the difference was not challenged, it was quietly smoothed away. So alongside that came something a little bit harder to articulate at the time, never quite feeling white enough or black enough. There was no clear place to stand. So identity for me was constantly questioned, adjusted and negotiated, often without the language to explain it. So over time, this communicated who institutions were built for. Compliance and adaptability became survival strategies. So the message was never explicit, but it was consistent. Belonging required adjustment. So that constant effort to try and fit in created a deep, often invisible fatigue for me. The exhaustion of always monitoring how much of yourself is acceptable in a given space. So intersectional research shows that overlapping identities don't create additive experiences, they create distinct ones. So for mixed race women, identity ambiguity often brings pressure to simplify ourselves so our systems, remain uncomfortable. So recognition, credibility, and belonging become uneven and unpredictable. My early response was to make myself smaller, to self-edit, to avoid disruption, and to over-prepare. So what is later labelled as imposter syndrome is often an organisational learned response to prolonged identity erosion. So when I entered higher education, another predominantly white space, I knew that if I wanted to not just succeed in leadership, but to change things for others, a conscious shift was required. So I didn't have the role models who shared my lived experience, but I did find others who understood this tension and form a network of global majority women who shared the same fatigue and experiences. But that support helped me to stop treating these experiences as personal shortcomings and start recognising them as structural signals. I learned to name what was happening and resist unnecessary adaptation and occupy space more deliberately. That experience now shapes definitely how I lead. So because I understand how early silencing and identity fatigue operate, I lead in ways that interrupt them by being intentional about voice, visibility, and belonging. People don't fail to belong, organisations fail to make belonging possible. The second leadership moment sits firmly within my early academic career. I was frequently the only person of colour in teams, navigating institutions that are historically white, as said, hierarchical and heavily reliant on informal networks and formal networks. There was no structured induction into academic culture. There was no clear mentoring or sponsorship, yet expectations were assumed rather than made explicit. So this is where the paradox of hypervisibility and invisibility became really clear. I was often invisible when it came to support and development, yet hypervisible as a symbol of diversity. So errors felt amplified, expertise was questioned more often, and successes were not recognised in the same way. Alongside this, that an unspoken expectation to take on more of a emotion and diversity labour, so being positioned as the diversity voice, work that is extremely important and matters, but is rarely valued in the promotional criteria. So running through all of this was a quieter pressure as well, the need to code switch. I became acutely aware of when parts of me felt more acceptable than others. At times I leaned more heavily into my white side of my heritage, how I spoke, how I presented myself, how much of the difference I revealed because it felt safer, more legible and less risky. But that constant calculation about how to show up is absolutely exhausting and comes at a cost. So what shifted for me was agency. So moving from coping within the system to navigating it intentionally. I realised that waiting for equitable systems to appear was not a strategy. I actively sought mentorship, not from people again who shared my lived experience, because there were very few, but from leaders who were willing to listen and invest and advocate and be honest about how power actually operates within the institutions. And those relationships helped me to decode academic norms, make the implicit explicit, and understand how decisions were really made. And alongside that, I became more intentional about boundary setting as well, being selective about unpaid labour, learning when to say no, aligning my work with progression rather than visibility alone. I stopped internalising self-doubt as weakness and began recognising it as a structural response to under-support and constant adaptation. That experience definitely now shapes how I lead. So because I understand how informal systems, code switch and identity fatigue operate, I prioritise sponsorship, not just mentorship. I make exceptions, expectations explicit. I intervene early and refuse to assume resilience or adaptation will compensate for the absence of support. The absence of support is not neutral. Informal systems often reproduce inequity far more powerfully than policy, and leaders either disrupt that or sustain it. The third leadership moment for me brings us into formal leadership. So I entered my first head of department role as the only person of colour on the senior management team, and still only recently as well. And this was a good few years ago. Inheriting a fractured department at the onset of COVID-19, I was leading through sustained crisis, navigating an atypical route into nursing leadership. I'm an ODP by background, so an AHP person, and overseeing one of the few nursing programs to remain fully operational during the pandemic, which was also the largest nursing associate apprenticeship nationally, with over 900 learners, multiple employee partners, intense regulatory scrutiny, including Ofsted. And alongside this, I became increasingly aware that communication, challenge, and credibility were experienced differently for me than maybe my other white counterparts in senior leadership spaces. And at the same time, the number of global majority women who sought after me to offer solidarity was really striking, and reinforcing both the weight of representation and the responsibility of visible leadership. This was leadership under sustained uncertainty. So I was really clear on that traditional academic leadership norms often prioritise distance and authority and control was not going to work in this context. So I made deliberate choices. I prioritised visible leadership. So that meant being present, accessible, and consistent during periods of anxiety and ambiguity. I led with compassion and clarity as well, creating physical and psychological safety while maintaining clear expectations and accountability. Decision making was intentionally inclusive, drawing on the expertise closest to the work rather than centralising control. I also focused on stabilising trust, being transparent when decisions were hard, naming uncertainty rather than masking it, and taking responsibility when things didn't go to plan, which was quite often. Crucially, I resisted the narratives of individual resilience and addressed structural pressures instead. So workload, communication and support systems, so people could perform without burning out. So this was not about being soft. It was about redistributing power and enabling collective ownership under pressure. And the outcomes were actually measurable. A re-energised award-winning department, improved student outcomes and experiences, strong staff progression, successful Ofsted and NMC outcomes for audits during one of the most challenging periods in higher education. This leadership lesson for me was clear. Inclusion is not soft leadership. It is high performance leadership. When leaders take structural responsibility, we unlock capability, accountability, and results. So up to this point, I've shared moments from my journey, and what I want to do now is make something really clear. What you've heard is not informal leadership, instinctive leadership, or personality-driven leadership. It's a framework-aligned leadership, even if I didn't always have the language for it at the time. So my insistence on being visible, naming identity, challenging silence, occupying space deliberately, aligns directly with authentic leadership. And this is about leading with self-awareness, values, and transparency rather than conformity. And we know that Advanced HE positions authentic leadership as critical for trust, credibility, and inclusion. So my experience taught me that visibility is not ego. It is a leadership act, particularly for those whose presence disrupt the norm. I spoke earlier about actively seeking mentorship and sponsorship, including from people who did not share my lived experience. The decision reflects distributed leadership, where influence, learning, and authority are not held by a single archetype. Advanced HE is clear that leadership pipelines depend on not just mentoring, but on sponsorship and advocacy. So I now operationalise this by making progression pathways explicit, sharing power intentionally, because leadership should not rely on informal access or cultural familiarity. And the way I lead teams, prioritising voice, challenge and safety, is grounded in inclusive leadership. Psychological safety is not a nice to have. It's a condition that allows people to contribute fully, especially when things are under pressure. And this aligns directly with Advanced HE's inclusive leadership principles, which emphasise fairness, respect, voice, and belonging as core leadership capabilities, not optional behaviours. My leadership pre and post COVID and Ofsted scrutiny required adapted leadership. So responding to uncertainty, adjusting strategy in real time, and holding people steady through ambiguity. Adaptive leadership recognises that technical solutions alone are insufficient in crises. What was required was sense making, communication, and collective problem solving, skills consistently highlighted in sector leadership frameworks. Inclusion as performance, not personality. And across all of this was a consistent thread. Inclusion in my practice is not about personal values alone. It is about performance, outcomes, and sustainability. So award-winning teams improve student outcomes, regulatory success. These were not achieved despite inclusive leadership, but because of it. My journey demonstrates that when leaders take structured responsibility rather than demanding individual resilience, they unlock capability, accountability, and results. This is not about diversifying leadership for representation alone. It's about modernising leadership capability for the complexity of higher education, for the uncertainty that it now faces. So the question is no longer whether inclusive leadership works. The question is whether our institutions are prepared to recognise it, reward it, and replicate it. This experience required leading squarely in what Advanced he describes as the grey zone. So it's moments where precedent is absent, certainty is unavailable, and decisions still have to be made. So during the pandemic and beyond, and even now, and the subsequent system reforms, leadership is not about following policy, because policy often lagged lived reality. It was about interpretation, holding anxiety in teams, creating clarity where there none existed, and making principled decisions in conditions of incomplete information. So crucially, leaders shaped by lived experience of misalignment are often better prepared for this kind of leadership. When you have spent your career navigating uncertainty, negotiating belonging, credibility, and ambiguity, you develop an ability to lead without over-reliance on rule books. So leading in the grey zone is not a deviation from leadership norms. It is a core future-ready leadership capability, particularly in higher education. So if higher education is serious about equity and leadership, three things for me must change, practically, not rhetorically. First, mentorship must be intentional, not accidental. Too often it relies on informal networks and affinity, benefiting those who already fit the dominant norms. Institutions need transparent resource mentoring and sponsorship, where leaders are expected to actively advocate, not just advise. Secondly, leadership pipelines need to be more visible. We talk about future leaders without showing how progression actually works. So clear pathways, explicit criteria, early exposure to leadership really do matter, especially for those less likely to be identified informally. And thirdly, data must disaggregate. When categories are collapsed, invisibility hides inequity. If we cannot see who is missing, we cannot address structural barriers. So the message is simple. Equity doesn't fail for the lack of intent. It fails when institutions rely on chance, vagueness, and incomplete data. And leadership requires doing this deliberately. I want to close by returning to Still I Rise and to Maya Angelou. I've always seen this quote as not poetry, but as a leadership truth. Because what mine and others' journey have shown me is that invisibility has a cost. When people are unseen, unnamed, unsupported, and statistically erased, institutions lose talent, insight, and leadership capacity. Invisibility doesn't just harm individuals, it weakens systems. Visibility, however, is about individual exposure or personal courage. It's about leadership responsibility. Who is visible in leadership signals who belongs. So whose knowledge counts and whose futures are imaginable. So leaders shape this not just through appointments, but through what they notice, what they challenge, and what they normalise. My lived experience, like many others, has never just been personal. It's been diagnostic. It reveals where systems strain, where leadership models fail, and where institutions ask individuals to adapt rather than asking themselves to change. And that is the real potential of lived experience in higher education leadership, not as testimony, not as an inspiration alone, but as data. Data that explores the blind spots, informs better decision making, and drives system change. So when I say still I rise, I don't mean that in spite of the challenges alone. I mean with clarity about what must change next. I'm not here because I overcame the system. I'm here despite it. And that tells us something critical about how leadership in higher education must change. Thank you very much. And any questions?
Thank you so much, Desita. And maybe we can stop the recording.